Before I begin this book review, I want to give a shout out to my friend Sean Wilson, also known as Rev Reads here on YouTube, who has helped me get up and running with this. A lot of folks are very interested in building a channel and aren't necessarily as interested in helping out a competitor. Not that I consider myself that, but Sean is the one who encouraged me to do book reviews and has given me advice on equipment, setup, techniques, all kinds of things. So a big thank you to Sean. The book I'm going to be talking about today is The Chosen People, Election, Paul, and Second Temple Judaism by A. Chadwick Thornhill. Election is a topic that has interested me for a long time, and if I were to give a brief summary of the landscape on election, I'd say the first position is the Reformed position. Election is God choosing, before time, certain individuals for salvation and passing over all the rest, leaving them unelected. Election in this view is unconditional, that is, no merit in the person is the cause for God electing them. Now, as an aside, I want to say that unconditional election in Reformed theology is frequently confused with particularism, that is, God selecting only some. But Karl Barth, who taught that all humanity is elect, also taught that that election was unconditional. So, particularism and unconditional election are not necessarily the same thing. Then there is the view that election is conditional, based on foreseen faith in the individual. That is a view held by some Arminian believers. We might also note a third view that election is to service rather than to salvation. In this view, the topic of election is somewhat relocated to not be primarily about salvation at all. Thornhill's book came by a recommendation to me, and if I were to summarize the argument the author makes, it's this. We can't really understand what Paul says in the New Testament about election unless we understand the intellectual and specifically the Jewish context he was shaped by and the writings of the Second Temple period. When we take these things into account, we arrive at a different understanding of election than what many have presented as the apostolic teaching. Thornhill is on the faculty of Liberty University and got his PhD there. He is an adherent of the new perspective on Paul, which, if you're not familiar with, it's too much to go into great detail here, but I'll just say that it presents a different understanding of what Paul means when he says works of the law. The Judaism of Paul's day, according to the new perspective, was not a religion of legalism, but one of grace. And what Paul objected to were so-called Jewish boundary markers like circumcision and the dietary laws being imposed on Gentiles. He wasn't speaking against those who do the law as a way of showing that they are in the covenant. Now, that's a very brief and crude summary, but I say this because it's important to understand Thornhill's view, but also to say that I personally do not hold to the new perspective. If you want a book that gives a great overview of this entire issue, I recommend Stephen Westerholm's Perspectives Old and New on Paul, the Lutheran Paul and his Critics. One of Thornhill's chief arguments is that the documents of the Second Temple period give important background information for us to understand the atmosphere that formed Paul. These are the things like the Testament of the 12 Patriarchs, Odes of Solomon, Jubilees. Documents like these give us a picture of how the Jews of Paul's day understood the concept of election. By and large, Thornhill argues, they understood election to be corporate, and the elect are those who are faithful to the covenant. In this sense, he sees it in some way as conditional also. The elect are those who do the covenant, that is, they pursue piety and obedience to God's will revealed in the law, the Torah. Thornhill considers the question of election from an ethnic, national perspective, which I think is good and important. That is, the Hebrew Bible deals with God's activity with the nation of Israel, and other nations enter and exit the scene as they interact with Israel. In short, the Jews are the chosen people, and God told them this very plainly in the Torah. People like Cornelius in Acts 10 are an example of where even Gentiles could become part of the elect if they submit themselves to the covenant stipulations. Thornhill provides examples from the literature where this thinking predates what we find in the New Testament, and he would say that the Second Temple writers also anticipated Gentile inclusion. In other words, election was not a pretemporal choosing of some for salvation and those not chosen are consigned to damnation. Thornhill doesn't present his research as any sort of refutation of Calvinism, though at various points he makes it clear that he doesn't hold to the idea of election and predestination that's common in Reformed theology. Throughout the book, Thornhill amasses a number of citations from the Second Temple literature to demonstrate this, and it's perhaps here where I have a difference of opinion on the weight we're able to give these writings. That Paul might have been influenced by them is perhaps true, but we don't have any way to affirm how much he was influenced. He says, for example, in Romans, and Isaiah is very bold, before he introduces a citation from the prophet. But he doesn't say anywhere, as we read in the Testament of Levi, for example. This is a perpetual challenge for any reader of the New Testament. That is, how much weight do we give to extra-canonical factors in our reading of these texts? Whether it's the surrounding culture or the literature of the period, these things may be helpful at times, but in my view, we cannot elevate them to having a determinative status as to how we interpret the New Testament texts. To do so is, in fact, to expand the canon and give other writings a status that belongs uniquely to the New Testament documents. Now, please understand me, I'm not claiming that Thornhill believes the Second Temple literature has equal status with the New Testament, but he does give it more weight in understanding the New Testament than I think is necessary. The other reason I say this is because despite the atmosphere Paul may have been trained in, despite his education as a Pharisee in the school of Gamaliel, the New Testament bears much evidence that he, in fact, contradicted his Jewish contemporaries. Romans and Galatians both bear witness to this. Given that, I think it becomes difficult to parse when Paul was following his contemporaries and when he deviates from them. Indeed, the whole of Galatians is an epistle of opposition to some of his fellow Jews. Also, spots in the pastoral epistles contain corrections to what he considered an erroneous understanding of the law. And Thornhill does at times acknowledge Paul's deviation from his fellow Jews. I differ with some of Thornhill's views on the place of the law in the current age as well, that is, the age of grace, as many have called it. For example, Thornhill says, through this act, that is, the death and resurrection of Jesus, the law took its proper place in the realm of the risen Jesus and the Spirit, where God's people, those who identify with his Messiah and submit to his Spirit, receive the enablement to fulfill this law and thus receive the promised eschatological life. Now, it could be that Thornhill is using the word fulfill as synonymous with keep, but what at first may seem like nitpicking becomes very important. Elsewhere, he does talk about the need to keep the law. We as believers don't keep the law, but we do fulfill the law. And we do so, ironically perhaps, without reference to the law, but rather with reference to love. If we love, we will fulfill the law, but if we focus on keeping the law, we may very well not arrive at love. Parenthetically, I also wonder what Thornhill means when he says eschatological life comes via fulfillment of the law, since Paul never assigns any life-giving role to the law. Others have argued for election being primarily corporate. William Klein and his book, The New Chosen People, comes to mind. While Klein makes some mention of the Second Temple documents, his case rests chiefly on the exegesis of the New Testament texts, and this is also why I think the section where Thornhill deals with the end of Romans 8 through the end of Romans 11 is in fact the strongest section of the book. Any reader would profit by considering the arguments he makes there. For example, one of his points is that elsewhere in Paul's letters, we find the idea that objects of wrath can become believers. That is, that they are not irrevocably predestined to eternal damnation. This is the other point Thornhill brings out in this section. He believes Paul is dealing with the place of Israel in election, not with the fate of individuals, a point others have brought out as well. Now, given what I've said, you may think I am not recommending this book. On the contrary, I do think this is a book any student of the New Testament should read. If one is going to deal with the rather complex topic of election, then being familiar with all of these issues is important. Thornhill does a good job of organizing the material and making his case. It's for individual readers to decide how much weight they give to the extra canonical evidence he summons to build that case. But I think it's nevertheless an important book. Thanks for listening, and if you have any questions about the book or if there's a book you'd like to see me review, please leave your thoughts in the comments.